Let's take a look at the week 3 study questions. Question 1, on the first page, the authors say, quote, "It is not unreasonable in certain cases to regard one's own death as a bad thing for oneself." What would Epicurus say to this? Why? This is rather obvious. But sometimes we have to reinforce the obvious. It's important to keep things straight. To establish a baseline. So, of course, Epicurus would say that that's incorrect, that it's not reasonable in any case to say that someone's death is a bad thing for them. It's one of the cornerstones of the Epicurean position. So clearly, and this is what the question is meant to do, to reinforce the idea that Bruckner and Fisher are, in general terms, arguing against the Epicurean position. Number 2, at the bottom of the first page, of the essay, the authors explain how, if death indeed is a bad for the person who dies, what kind of bad it would be. And that's important, right? There are different sorts of bads. How do they characterize the kind of bad it would be? What would be the kind of bad that is not experienced as bad by the person, or an unexperienced bad? And they pretty much rely on Nagel's essay as a foundation for that there are that sort of thing, right? That some bads are not experienced as bad by the person, which was what Nagel is pretty much trying to establish. Again, something that would, one of the big points in Nagel's essay is that the Epicurean position is wrong about bads. That the Epicurean position would seem to confine bads to bads that we actually directly experience. And Nagel's whole point really is that there are other sorts of bads that happen to someone that are the kind of bads that are not experienced by them. Number 3, what do the authors mean when they say we normally have asymmetric attitudes towards prenatal non-existence and posthumous non-existence? That is death. This is really cornerstone of the whole thing, is to gain a grasp of what the asymmetry problem actually is. We have different attitudes. We give them different values. Specifically, we regard posthumous non-existence as a bad thing and we care about it, while we regard prenatal non-existence, if we regard it at all, as not a bad thing and we're indifferent to it. That is, we care about the fact that we won't exist after we die, but we don't really care about the fact that we didn't exist before we were born. Number 4, the authors explain that posthumous non-existence can be seen as a period of deprivation, because had we not died when we did, but later, we would have gone on to experience more of the goods of life. How do they suggest that prenatal non-existence can be seen as a period of deprivation? Well, it's important to see that they believe, unlike Nagel, that we could have been born earlier and significantly earlier than we were born. That's crucial to understanding their position. Just as we will die at a certain point, but it's possible that we could have died later. And if we had died later, we would experience more of the goods of life. So dying when we did, rather than later, represents a deprivation. On the other side, we are all born at a certain time, at a certain point. Their position is that we could have been born earlier and significantly earlier. And had we been born earlier, we would have experienced more of the goods of life. So that period, that difference, is a period of deprivation. So it's really important to see that in their position, that they're setting up this thing where really the asymmetry problem, and rejecting Nagel's quick solution to it, and saying that, yes, both prenatal and posthumous non-existence, both of them are periods of deprivation of goods. Number 5, explain why Epicurus would say that the only rational attitude towards prenatal and posthumous non-existence is to regard them as having the same value, because both of them are nothing to us. Both of them are because we cannot experience anything before we're born, and because we cannot experience anything after we die, both prenatal and posthumous non-existence have the same value, which is no value. We should be indifferent. We should be indifferent to the fact that before we were born, we didn't have any experiences of the goods of life, and we should be indifferent to the fact that after we die, we will not have any experience of the goods of life. What is the asymmetry problem? What would it mean to solve the asymmetry problem? I think I've already laid out. I think question 3 actually asked you to define the asymmetry problem. There's some redundancy here. But what would it mean to solve the asymmetry problem? That's important. To solve the asymmetry problem in the sense that the authors have laid it out would be to justify the asymmetric treatment we give to prenatal and posthumous non-existence. That is, to put on a rational foundation, to say it's not inconsistent to regard death as a bad thing, but not regard prenatal non-existence as a bad thing. So, as I was saying, you have to, in the videos, you would have to establish that there is a relevant difference between prenatal non-existence and posthumous non-existence, which would justify their asymmetric treatment. Number 7, why do the authors reject Nagel's solution to the asymmetry problem? Nagel says that we couldn't have been born much earlier than we were, so it makes no sense to regret something that couldn't have happened. So you can't regret your prenatal non-existence. You can't regret not having been born much earlier than you were. They reject that idea because they reject the idea that the time at which you're born is an essential characteristic of you. That is, they don't think that that's obvious. It may be true, but they don't think that Nagel has actually provided a good argument for it. They give an example of Socrates. If Socrates had been born 10 years earlier than he was, why does that in itself mean that he wouldn't have been Socrates, the same Socrates? So the whole point of them, or not the point, but the relevance of their rejection of Nagel's solution to the asymmetry problem is that they have to come up with a different solution, which is what they devote the essay to. Number 8, what is Parfit's hypothetical on page 215 meant to prove? Let me just look at it real quick, just to make sure that I don't give you a wrong answer. Yeah, it's his first hypothetical. Okay, so the hypothetical on page 215 is meant to prove that we prefer to have our bad experiences in the past rather than in the future. That if, in this sort of tortured example, it's rather strained and kind of ridiculous example, it is meant to establish that we all regard it to be rational behavior to prefer to have our bad experiences in the past. That is, that a bad experience takes on a different value for us depending on whether it's in the past or the future. And this would seem to point towards a solution to the asymmetry problem in rather obvious ways. Number 9, why do the authors think that Parfit's hypothetical does not apply to a bad like death? Because they argue that although normally we regard it to be rational to have a temporal preference for our experienced bads to be in the past, when it comes to unexperienced bads, they say, we are indifferent to whether they're in the past or the future. And this has obvious implications for the asymmetry problem because death is an unexperienced bad. So if we were to be consistent, then we should be indifferent to whether we should be indifferent about, or we should regard it as the same, whether we're talking about prenatal or posthumous non-existence. Number 10, how is Parfit's second hypothetical on page 217 different from his first one? His second one is a little harder to understand, but the second one deals with an unexperienced bad. And the point of the second hypothetical is to show that we indeed are indifferent to whether unexperienced bads are in the past or the future. Number 11, not yet being born deprived us of pleasures we would have had we been born earlier than we were. Right. dying will deprive us of pleasures we will experience if we die later than we actually will. Why do the authors think that it's rational to care more about the latter than the former? Because we care more about future pleasures than we do about past ones. So we care more about the prospect of being deprived of future pleasures than we do of the fact that we were deprived of pleasures in the past.